where we are is actually pretty dangerous already. And just because we haven't seen, bombs going off doesn't mean that, we're any more safe. We really are at a pretty precarious moment in terms of our digital vulnerability.
So a generation or two ago, everyone knew what Hiroshima meant, or Sputnik, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, or START treaties. Those were words that signified major events in the global Cold War arms race. Today, consciously or not, we're learning new words like Stuxnet, solar winds, colonial pipeline, Pegasus, or zero-day exploit. We're developing a new vocabulary in a new arms race. The cyber arms race doesn't concern guns or warheads, but instead is digital warfare waged to, say, influence elections, or shut off power grids, or even to spy on your cell phone. So how did the cyber weapons arms race begin, and how has it evolved? And what can be done about its multiplying threats? Here to discuss this fascinating and scary topic, we are joined tonight by Nicole Perlroth, author of This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, the Cyber Weapons Arms Race. She is an award-winning cybersecurity journalist for the New York Times, where her work has been optioned for both film and television. She's covered Russian hacks of nuclear plants, airports, and elections, North Korea's cyber attacks against movie studios, banks and hospitals, Iranian attacks on oil companies, banks, and the Trump campaign, and hundreds of Chinese cyber attacks, including a months-long hack of the Times. So, Ms. Perlroth, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, everyone, or see me?
Yes. So, Nicole, I think I'm one of the audience members you intended for this book. It's a big book, but it's in an approachable style that can help ordinary folks like me understand these extraordinary matters. It's such a big book that I thought we would, in our little conversation here, focus on kind of the World Affairs Council angle, which traditionally is national security, national interests, that kind of thing. Although, of course, we are very happy to hear whatever you want to share with us tonight. So just to keep, as I said, these complicated matters simple, can you tell us about the cyber arms race? Why do you call it an arms race? And what have been the major points in it so far? And how about that recent Pegasus hack, which you wrote about last week in the Times? How would that fit into this arms race?
Right. So lots of questions. First, let me just say thank you so much for having me, Mary. And thank you to everyone at the World Affairs Council and everyone joining in for what I'm sure is your 1000th Zoom webinar of this ongoing pandemic. I really appreciate everyone tuning in. And I wish we were doing this in person over chowder and drinks. That sounds lovely right now. It's still 3 p.m. here on the West Coast. So unfortunately, I have a couple more hours before I get there. But what is the cyber arms race? So let me just back up and say I've been working at the Times for 10 years now on cybersecurity. And basically the first 3 years were just nonstop cyber attacks. First it was low-level stuff, anonymous, getting upset with the Vatican or the CIA or the Church of Scientology and taking down their websites. Then it was countless Chinese cyber attacks, Chinese cyber espionage aimed at companies like Google and RSA and Lockheed Martin. But then my own employer at the New York Times, where I was able to actually sit with our security team in bed with them and watch as the guy we came to affectionately call the Beijing summer intern would roll into our networks at 9 a.m. Beijing time and roll out around 5 in search of our sources. And then it was Iran. Iran went from these sort of know-nothing hackers to taking out 30,000 computers and servers at Saudi Aramco, world's richest oil company, where they replaced it all with an image of a burning American flag. And we started to see Iranian hackers launch denial of service attacks on Wall Street and banks. We saw North Korea take that one step further with their hack at Sony Pictures, where they didn't just decimate data and take systems offline, they actually leaked executives' emails. And we saw a couple executives get fired. We saw Russia then borrow some of that playbook in the 2016 election when it did a hack and leak of DNC emails and Hillary Clinton's communications and John Podesta. So what I was seeing across these attacks when I stepped back and pulled my head out of the water was a clear through line that the enemy was a very good teacher. That was very true in cyber. Each of these attacks just got significantly worse than the last, that there were new players coming into this game, that these were players that knew that they would never be able to match our military budgets, our spending on kinetic weaponry, but they could do a lot of harm to the United States in cyber. And in fact, we had a very soft underbelly because we've been digitizing our economy, our healthcare systems, critical infrastructure at accelerated rates, while still very much in this very old school mindset of that we're still an island surrounded by two oceans, when that's just not true on the internet. So we saw these attacks pick up. And what struck me was, where is the cavalry here? You know, who's doing anything about this? And what I was seeing in each attack I was covering is that there was no cavalry. You know, businesses, for the most part, were allowed to basically bury the theft of their intellectual property, because so long as hackers didn't touch their customers' PII data, their personal identifying information, they didn't have to report it. And I saw that firsthand. You know, at the New York Times, we didn't really have to come out and say China breached our networks and here's what they stole, because they didn't touch employee information or customer information. But we wanted to make clear, wow, this is the new normal. You know, we are all getting breached, whether we know it or not. And when we briefed the FBI, I just remember being there and thinking, oh, good, you know, we're going to tell the FBI everything we have here. We're going to hand over our logs, and they're going to tell us who's doing this and tell us, you know, how they're going to make it stop. Well, that couldn't have been further from the case. They just closed their binders, said thank you very much, and we never heard from them again. And it was clear to me that no one was securing their networks the way that they now needed to in this new era, where private businesses were being expected to defend themselves from nation state level attacks. And then there was this other thing, which was, what was the US government doing? What were intelligence agencies doing? And there had always been murmurings that the US partook in a market for cyber vulnerabilities. That is, when they would find a vulnerability in Microsoft or Apple or Google systems, they would stockpile it rather than get it fixed. They would stockpile it. And actually, I was hearing murmurings, and there'd been some reporting on this, of a market where governments, through brokers or intermediaries, would pay hackers to turn over those holes in software, not so the government could get them fixed, but so that they could exploit them for counterintelligence and potentially sabotage if they needed to, like the case of Stuxnet, where we used a series of holes in Microsoft software and Schneider Electric to basically dismantle some of the centrifuges at Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. So I just couldn't wrap my head around this. Like, wait a minute. Governments aren't working towards cybersecurity. They're actually working towards cyber sabotage and preserving vulnerabilities so that they can use them for counterterrorism and counterintelligence. So does that mean our taxpayer dollars are furthering these programs that only further our own cyber vulnerability? What are these programs? When did they start? What are the trade-offs that are being made? You know, which agencies are engaging in this? When they pay hackers for these vulnerabilities, how much are they paying them? How do we know these hackers aren't double dealing? How do we know they're not selling those vulnerabilities to other governments and other nations, many of whom are probably not our friends? And that is what launched me into this project of the cyber arms race. And what I found was I was able to, and I'm sure I've only scratched the surface here, I promise, but what I discovered was that, yes, in the 90s, US government agencies basically launched the cyber arms race when they started paying hackers to turn over these vulnerabilities and never tell a soul. And they started using them for counterintelligence. And with Stuxnet, they started using them for sabotage. And that was a bloody masterpiece of an attack. We could talk about that one all day. But basically what it was an nuclear proliferation effort. It was to get inside Natanz, destroy some of the centrifuges, set back Iran's nuclear ambitions a couple of years, and essentially force them to the negotiating table when it came time to get together for the Iran nuclear deal. And the problem is that the code got out. And when it got out, countries all over the world weren't admiring what the US had just done. What they were admiring was, wow, you can use code and vulnerabilities in code to take out an adversary's nuclear ambitions, a nuclear plant. And so since then, we've seen every country, I always say with the exception of Antarctica, although someone added the Vatican to my list the other day, develop their own offensive stockpile of cyber weapons and the raw material for cyber weapons, which are these basic holes and vulnerabilities in code. And those kinds of attacks and that kind of exploitation of software vulnerabilities is now coming back and boomeranging back on us in a big way. So just this year, just in 2021, we've seen these kind of attacks on Microsoft Exchange systems in the United States. We just saw them with the zero-click attack on Apple's iPhones, Macs, watches, by Pegasus, which is a spyware from NSO, an Israeli spyware dealer. So this market has always been unregulated. There's never been oversight because this is a market where governments are customers, they're not regulators. But it is getting out of control. And I was hoping to get this book out before we got here. And the book couldn't have come out at a better time because it came out in February. And since then, we've seen a series of these attacks using these software vulnerabilities from Iran, from Russia, from China, over and over and over again.
Okay, so what we're seeing is, sort of almost the wages of the U.S.'s own strategies. With calamitous effects. So another very simple question for you, assuming that many folks haven't read the book yet, what does the title of your book mean to you? And can you tell us the story behind it to help us understand this calamity that we're in?
So the title came to me in the shower one day, as all good ideas do. This is how they tell me the world ends. And really the origin of it was that when I joined the New York Times cybersecurity beat, you just heard a lot about the cyber Pearl Harbor, the cyber Hiroshima, cyber 9/11. And back when I started, I remember asking everyone who used those terms, okay, so how long, how far away are we from some calamitous cyber-induced attack? And almost comically, with dark humor, they all had the same answer every time. It was always 18 to 24 months. In other words, it's just far enough that, I might forget that they had made this prediction by the time it didn't happen or happened. But just close enough to add urgency to it. And I spent a lot of my time trying to understand, is this hype or is this not hype? And it was really in sort of delving into the cyber arms race and seeing just how unregulated this market had become and just how far it was spreading and to really unexpected corners of the globe. I actually spend a lot of time in the book in Argentina, where I found that there's a whole new crop of hackers and security researchers who are finding these vulnerabilities and they're selling them to governments but they don't have the same sort of east-west moral calculus or narrative, I should say, that we have at play here in the United States. So when I ask these hackers in Argentina a really stupidly phrased question, frankly, do you only sell to good Western governments? They laughed in my face and they said, Nicole, we don't think of the United States as a good Western government. We would rather sell actually to China or Iran. I think what he actually said was, last time I checked, the government that bombed another country into oblivion wasn't Iran or China. So we don't actually care who you are. We'll just sell to whoever brings us the biggest bag of cash. And that was really my epiphany, that this market is so beyond our control at this point. And we don't understand that with all this digitization and the connecting of our most critical infrastructure to the internet, we've created the world's ripest attack surface. And so I really do think the next war will either be a cyber war or will have some major cyber component to it. And I think the country that wins that war is going to look a lot like a digital Israel, a country that can really still maintain basic services and resilience under constant hostile activity. And right now, the United States is not that country. And we're seeing that every day with our own eyes, with the Colonial Pipeline attack and the hack on the water treatment facility last February, where hackers got in because they didn't use two-factor authentication or they were using a decade-old version of Windows. We are not even at a baseline of cybersecurity. So coming back to the question around the title, I used to think this was hype, but the more I sort of followed this journey into the cyber arms market and the players involved and the motivations involved, I realized that actually we are overdue for some kind of cataclysmic event. But also, this attention to cyber Hiroshima and cyber 9/11, the words have always been a little bit of a distraction from where we already are right now. And I actually think the more apt analogy is a plague, like a pandemic. I mean, it really, when you look around, every major US intelligence agency has been hacked. We've seen, our critical infrastructure increasingly get hacked and now held for ransomware. We're finding Russia poking around our nuclear plants and our power grid. And we just declassified a report that concluded that China has been hacking our pipelines, not for intellectual property theft, but to maintain an advantage in the event of some future geopolitical conflict. So where we are is actually pretty dangerous already. And just because we haven't seen, bombs going off doesn't mean that, we're any more safe. We really are at a pretty precarious moment in terms of our digital vulnerability. I also just wanted a title that would wake people up. And so that's how it came to be.
Okay, good. So I'm wondering, I'm still going to look backwards, then we're going to look forwards for a minute. In a sense, I look at this and I think, well, how could it have been otherwise? The US made evidently a big mistake in our approach to cybersecurity by kind of empowering hackers. And I'd like to learn a little bit more about how that worked. And at the same time, I wonder, isn't that sort of what you get with an open, innovative system that we take such pride in, that has done so much for so many people? Could it have gone any differently? So what went poorly and could it have gone better?
So, it's not, it's interesting. I wanted to get behind this dynamic. I don't think it was that the United States empowered hackers. I think they just actually seized on their discontent, because for years, hackers tried to, and hacker I use as sort of a loose word, it's worth just defining. We've conflated hackers with cyber criminals, but really a hacker is someone who just finds a way to use a system for a means that it was never intended for. And that can be for good or bad. And for years, even with the advent of ARPANET, at the Pentagon, sort of the early iteration of the internet, there were all kinds of warnings from hackers inside government who said, this, this could really open us up to a lot of danger and many attacks, because you cannot trust with an open system that it can't be exploited for nefarious means or for a supply chain attack. I mean, we saw these warnings even before we got to the commercial internet. And then when we got to the commercial internet, we saw, and I spend a lot of time on this in the book, but companies like Microsoft were really caught off guard by Netscape and sort of the advent of the web browser. And so they were just racing to catch up. They really just sort of missed the internet. And so they were racing to catch up, and they were putting out this code and the software and these servers at such a fast pace that no one ever stopped to consider security. And it was really the hackers that would call up Microsoft and say, wait a minute, I just was able to use your software to break into NASA. And they would just get ignored. Or in some cases, they might get a threatening letter from a general counsel. And after several years of this, government agencies realized, wow, these hackers who are sort of this embittered crowd online talking about all these vulnerabilities they're finding in Microsoft's code. And it wasn't just Microsoft, it was Oracle and HP and Intel and really everyone at that point. We could use those vulnerabilities to spy on our enemies or spy on, the Russian embassy in Kiev, or, name your possible target. And so they started sort of exploiting hackers' discontent and saying, hey, not only are we not going to yell at you for what you're doing, we'll actually pay you 6 figures for that hole you found in Microsoft's Internet Explorer, so long as you never tell anyone about it. Because the minute Microsoft learns about it and actually does something about it, then we lose our access to that target system. So that's sort of the way it went. It was just as much the industry's fault here as it was the government's for sort of seizing on this. Now, I think your question is a totally legitimate one, which is, isn't this inevitable? And I think it probably is inevitable. So as data became the new oil, governments were going to be willing to spend a lot of money to access that data, just like we always have, only now it was far easier. They didn't have to send someone with a camera to snapshot, photos of files in a cabinet somewhere in Moscow. Now they could just hack into their computer or their network and get those files in real time. So yes, it was probably inevitable, but we were just at the same time digitizing everything without ever thinking about the security implications. And unfortunately, all these people that have been whining about this for years were just outright ignored. And, we were just using this code that was basically developed by 2 guys on a shoestring budget and baking it into Pentagon weapon systems and into the grid and into some of our most critical systems without ever thinking about how it could potentially be exploited. So there's a lot we could have done decades ago to mitigate this problem and really introduce secure by design processes into this code before it became critical infrastructure. And that's really what it's become. Right. But instead, we just sort of we just dove straight in and never really thought about this. And so Stuxnet became a wake-up call, but more of a wake-up call for other countries about what could be done with offense. It never really became our wake-up call for defense. And in fact, when I started at the New York Times, it became my party trick. Like I would go to a party and I would say, do you know what Stuxnet is? And nobody knew what it was. And I was like, let me tell you this story about how the US and Israel used code to destroy Iran's uranium centrifuges. It just never really made its way into the public consciousness in the way it made its way to our adversaries and their consciousness around how they could potentially use these tools for their own purposes. And that's what we're seeing playing out now.
Right. Well, I do want to get to our audience questions, but my wrap-up question really falls out of what we were just talking about. So too briefly, I wonder, kind of looking forward, I was thinking along the lines of the arms races that we've, in international relations, we've all studied in the past. They had nations as competitors, right? Who were presumably pursuing some kind of national interest or their understanding of national interest. And now it seems that we have nations as well as all of these subnational actors. Some of them may be commercial or individuals or straight up, bad guys, mobs. And so there's a proliferation of motivations as well. So it's not just national interests, it's what all these interests of these different players are. So if in the past arms control treaties, successful arms control treaties grew out of arms races, what kinds of international actions could work now in this multiplayer environment? And as I said, we don't really have time for this, but what should we be thinking about on the international and global level to deal with these threats?
Yeah, it's such a big question, and you're right. And unfortunately, nuclear analogies always seem to fall apart when it comes to cyber, just because the difficulty of attribution, and because you're right, we're not just dealing with national actors, we're dealing with transnational actors and cyber criminals, and sometimes it's not clear whether they're one and the same, like we're seeing with ransomware. And we just saw some indictments of Chinese hackers who were responsible for the recent attack on Microsoft Exchange systems. But in some of the DOJ disclosures, what they said was actually the same Chinese contractors who were pulling off that Microsoft Exchange hack would also then, pivot to their personal life and go exploit some of those vulnerable systems for ransomware. And sort of similarly, we've seen in Russia, we've seen groups, ransomware groups, cyber criminals hit systems like Colonial Pipeline that pose, a huge threat to our national security and our economic interests. But it's not clear whether it's Putin just turning a blind eye or subtly encouraging that kind of activity ahead of nuclear arms talks. So, this is a very messy world, and how you deal with that, I think, is a really complicated question. But I think the first thing you do is you stop leaving yourself so vulnerable. And I think that means, that entails all of the boring things that we've all heard we've needed to do for years, but for whatever reason, largely inconvenience, we just haven't done them. So it means making sure that our critical infrastructure is not using a decade-old version, unpatched version of Microsoft Windows. It means turning on multi-factor authentication. It means vetting vendors and vetting their code to make sure that it's not a Russian conduit. And all of that is very, very difficult. But you have to do that before you even get to the policy level. And then, let's say we can raise the bar that high. What do you do about policy and norms and rules? Well, Brad Smith at Microsoft has been out there pitching for a digital Geneva Convention, which I think on paper sounds very reasonable. Why shouldn't we set up some sort of international norms that say we won't hack civilian systems, we won't hack hospitals or the power grid or water treatment facilities? I think that sounds completely reasonable. The problem is it all falls apart in the fine print and in this world of transnational actors, because, and this is what US intelligence officials told me as I was interviewing them for the book, most of the attacks that come out of the United States come from Cyber Command at the Pentagon, or the counterterrorism and counterintelligence comes out of the NSA and the CIA and some of our other intelligence agencies. We do not tap the guy at Google on the shoulder at night and say, hey, tonight you're moonlighting for us and you're going to hack into this Russian utility company and plant our code there. So all of the attacks come from within government itself. So we could agree to not hack into civilian systems like the Russian power grid. The problem is, even if Russia or Putin was to agree to that, Russia and China and Iran and North Korea all have this very murky relationship with cyber criminals in those countries. So our fear is that even if we were to agree to something like that, we would only be handcuffing ourselves, because Putin could just then sort of quietly encourage Russia's cyber criminals to attack the next colonial pipeline or the grid, and then say, as he said in 2017, hackers are like artists. They just wake up in the morning and start painting. We have nothing to do with what they do or don't do. So when you're dealing with the Putins and the Xis of the world, it's very hard to even think about agreeing to some kind of international norms, which is why I think the more realistic take at this point is, let's just focus on our own cyber defense, because it is far too easy to take out the US economy or the grid, or potentially even impact an election, as politicized as that discussion has become, using cyber vulnerabilities. And that's just not acceptable, because we are,
Very good. Okay, so take care of our situation at home. So we're going to go to questions, and our first question is going to come from Mark Schreiber, and I want to remind everyone that we're going to be having a post-chat, which everyone should come to, with Mark, who's the Senior Counsel of Global Privacy and Cybersecurity at McDermott, Will and Emery. So Mark, what's your question?
Sure, thanks so much. And Nicole, I think on behalf of all of us, we wanted to show our appreciation for such a well-written, clear book. You really are a translator of difficult technical topics, even for those of us in the field, and all of us have learned so much from it. So I have two questions. One, sort of what you see as the worst case scenario. And in that context, let me just do two quotes from your book. One from General Keith Alexander, director of the NSA, referring to yet another hacker zero-day expert or authority, or painter, as you will. Quote, "The most likely way for the world to be destroyed, most experts agree, is by accident. That's where we come in. We're computer professionals. We cause accidents." And then another quote that you referred to in the Ukraine attacks by Russia, when the screens went dark and you couldn't get your money out of the ATMs and government facilities weren't working, quote, "Everyone remembered where they were and what they were doing the moment the screens went dark." So my question is, what do you see as the worst case scenario? What in the deepest, darkest moments outside of the shower do you consider the unfortunate possibilities of where things might go?
Yeah. This is the question. First of all, thank you so much for calling me a translator. I knew this book couldn't succeed in accomplishing my mission if I didn't write it in a way that my mom could understand. And, my mom does email, but she doesn't do online banking. She didn't know what a 0-day was. So anyways, thank you for that. So worst case scenario, I think unfortunately is not that far off from where we are right now. We have found China in our pipelines. We found Russian hackers probing our nuclear plants and the power grid. We've probed their power plants, and I broke that story with my colleague David Sanger. We're all sort of in each other's systems, which has sort of led us fumbling to this mutually assured digital destruction. And that's the status of things. But what disturbs me is when I see Russia hack a Saudi petrochemical company and use a series of 0 days in Schneider Electric to dismantle the safety locks at that plant. And when I see Russia hack a French television station and claim to be ISIS, and when I see them hack into Iran's attack infrastructure and we catch them there, only we've caught them there 8 months after the fact, it's clear to me that they're playing around with attribution. They're experimenting, not just with the capabilities that they have been in Ukraine, where we have seen them, shut the power off and do all sorts of things, shut down access to ATMs and gas stations. But we're also seeing them experiment with attribution. And what that means is when an attack comes our way, we might not necessarily be able to respond quickly, or if we do, we might not hit the right guy. It might not be Iran that just did that attack on an American petrochemical company. It might be Russia who'd hacked into Iran systems and launched the attack from there. So I worry about that. I worry about that sort of miscalculation. And we've gotten very close to that before. I tell the story in the book about how during the Obama administration, Michael Daniel got that proverbial 3 a.m. phone call from John Brennan, who said they're in the Bowman Dam. They had caught Iranian hackers inside the Bowman Dam. Now, turns out there's 2 Bowman Dams in the United States. One of them is in Oregon, and if you hacked into that dam and unlocked the gates to that dam, you'd really get yourself a terrorist attack that could have potentially killed thousands of people. But it turned out they were in the other Bowman Dam, which was in, I think, Westchester County or Westchester somewhere. And it was like a babbling brook, and it was down for construction. And so, there was just this potential for serious miscalculation there. We assumed they were in this bigger dam. We would have retaliated right away. And fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and they waited for the forensics to sort of come out to see what this was. But I worry the most about a situation where cooler heads don't prevail. You have an attack by an actor on, a petrochemical plant here that would cause some crazy, dangerous explosion, and us retaliating only potentially on the wrong guy. So, we've gotten so close to this. We just haven't seen it yet, almost because we've been lucky. And, in terms of what the attack I most worry about is I worry about the attack on the petrochemical plant, just because we've caught Iran and Russia sort of practicing there, I guess you'd say. But what I really worry about is the silent killer of attacks, which is an attack on a water treatment facility that would contaminate the water by remotely messing with the chemical controls. And it's interesting because the day my book came out was the day that the police announced in Oldsmar, Florida, that a hacker had tried to do that. And we still don't know who that guy or gal was, or nation state. But why anyone would get into these water treatment facilities and up the level of lie in the water is beyond me. But I think that's the future of what terrorism might look like. And unfortunately, all that enabled it was a decade-old version of Windows software and the lack of multi-factor authentication. So, I'm not telling you about one attack. I'm just these are the attack scenarios that I've seen happen. And I just really worry about, I guess the one I worry about most is water.
Okay, thank you. All right, we're gonna, and thanks for your question, Mark. We're gonna go to Charles now. Charles, go right ahead.
Thank you very much, Nicole. What a terrific book you've written. And the dark alleys you had to walk down to find all this background information. It was really kind of a mystery book in a way. But I do have a question about your analogy about a plague, which I thought was very apt. We're dealing with a plague now called COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a vaccine.
Okay.
And we're trying to make sure that we get people to use the vaccine because a lot of people are resisting. We don't really have a vaccine for cyber hacking. And even if we did, how could we marshal the resource? What would we have to marshal in terms of resources to get whatever that vaccine might be into every computer in the country?
Thank you.
So it's such a good question. Thank you. And the reason I think a plague is a good analogy is because in most cases, with the exception of ransomware now, these are threats you really can't see. And I actually have been, sorry for this tangent, but I actually think ransomware has been a blessing in disguise in that, with all of these images of people unable to get gas because of the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, it's just been a blessing in disguise because finally these are attacks that people can see. It's really hard to hide a ransomware attack. But the reason I also think a plague is a good analogy is because, like COVID, governments obviously have a very clear role to play in setting policies around lockdowns and social distancing, et cetera. But businesses also have a big role to play, in developing a vaccine and the vaccine rollout, but also, determining what they're going to do with their employees and how to keep systems running and keep systems resilient. And then individuals also have a role to play by wearing masks and getting vaccinated and maintaining social distancing. And the same is very true in cyber. A lot of these attacks come down to an employee with a dumb password who didn't have two-factor authentication turned on. So we're not going to be able to solve the problem unless the individual understands that they play a significant role in thwarting these threats. Likewise, businesses have a big role to play in developing more resiliency and isolating the crown jewels, in segmenting things like their core operations or their pipeline from the rest of the internet. And then governments have a huge role to play in sort of determining cyber defense or rules around cyber defense. And unfortunately, here in the United States, we're constrained by the fact that we are in a free market economy, that anytime we've tried to introduce new cyber regulations that would just raise the bar for the cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure, it's been kicked down by lobbyists who say it's too expensive or it's too onerous or we don't need regulations in this space. And so we've basically left it to the private sector to determine just how secure or vulnerable we are. So, all that to say that I do think the plague is an apt analogy because it's shared accountability. But unfortunately in cyber, when you look at what governments have been doing, they've actually been making a lot of trade-offs on cybersecurity in the name of what we used to think of as national security without realizing that they're one and the same. And likewise, individuals were still acting out of a desire for convenience, and sort of we're still buying into this Silicon Valley promise of a frictionless society where we can access everything from our Nest to our pacemaker, from our phones. And so, all of this to say that all the market forces here are leading us down a path of further vulnerability, but you can ignore it because you can't see it. And I really do hope, and I think ransomware has really changed the conversation, and SolarWinds. Finally, we're talking about things like zero trust, like a software bill of materials, about exploring vendors and making sure that they're vetting their code and they're vetting the code that makes its way into the code. And it's just because this thing has gotten more visible, and it's sort of like COVID. I mean, remember all the people who didn't think it was real and thought it was some kind of sham until it hit them or their family member? The same thing's really true in cybersecurity. People don't take it seriously. Businesses don't take it seriously. Governments don't take it seriously until they each have their own wake-up call. And so, it sounds like you've read the book, so you've seen, it's like everyone only acts when they've had their wake-up call. Google only acted after it was hit by China. Activists and dissidents only got involved in digital security once they saw that they were getting hit by NSO Pegasus spyware. The New York Times only acted once we were hit by China. Businesses really only start spending on security once they realize their intellectual property has been carted out the door by Chinese state-sponsored hackers. And we see this over and over and over again. So long-winded.
Wake-up call.
Yeah.
Indeed. All right, thank you. So we're going to try to fit in a few more questions because we have a number of people. Right now, I think we're going to Debbie Smith, one of our board members. Hi, Debbie. Go right ahead.
Unmute myself. Okay, great. Oh, hi, Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and for your scholarship. I'm, once perplexed, fascinated, scared, etc. And kind of on the heels of Mary's question about how to respond, how can nation states respond in the traditional sense? I was wondering, is there any room for diplomats in this space? It almost makes them seem very quaint in terms of engaging, because if we're vulnerable to attacks, how can you convene a language or diplomacy around that? So I was just very curious as to how we.
It's so easy to be cynical when you're me. You're just constantly covering these attacks. But I love this question because it reminds me that diplomacy actually has had impact in some really crucial moments. So in 2016, yes, Russia did a hack and leak of the DNC. Yes, they launched an extraordinary disinformation campaign via social media. Yes, they breached our voter registration databases in nearly every state. We learned that piecemeal, but ultimately it was almost every state. But they stopped short of changing the votes, as far as we can tell. So what did it? And I that is a question that keeps me up at night. Was it John Brennan's phone call to his counterpart at the FSB saying, if you do anything to this election, you can expect a response? Did that have impact? Or did Putin calculate that he had done enough damage? The conclusions we hear are that they concluded Hillary would win, and the goal was just to damage her enough once she assumed her role as president. Maybe they determined that they'd done everything they needed to do. They didn't need to actually change the votes. But I wonder whether John Brennan, played a role there. Similarly, there were a lot of conversations that happened ahead of the 2018 midterm elections, that basically said, you touch these elections, and oh, by the way, have you noticed that we've been doing some really loud attacks of your power grid recently? So there's that. And then, more recently, it was, Biden making cybersecurity the #1 priority in his discussions with Putin at the summit in Geneva. And if you remember, what he said afterwards in his press conference was, I asked him, and in a very Biden folksy way, it's hard to read, but he said, if you remember, I asked him, how would you feel if hackers hit your pipelines and took out your pipelines? Now, most people thought that was just Biden being folksy, but the cynical, me was thinking, wow, actually, what a great diplomatic message. Your entire economy is based on gas and oil. So, imagine what that retribution might look like for you. So, and after that, we haven't seen that kind of ransomware attack on critical infrastructure. We've seen other stuff, but we haven't seen that kind of ransomware attack. And we saw the group behind it sort of disappear, although they're back. So maybe there is a role for sort of this diplomatic maneuvering in this very high tech space. But it's always hard to measure, like diplomacy, usually is. It's harder to measure. But I definitely think there's a role. If you remember North Korea, after they hacked Sony, there was a lot of, Barack Obama getting on television and saying, we know this was North Korea and we'll respond at a time and place of our choosing. And we haven't seen North Korea conduct that kind of cyber sabotage since. We have seen them pivot towards financially motivated attacks, where they've hit things like cryptocurrency exchanges. They managed to steal $80 million from the Bank of Bangladesh. They're clearly using cyber to generate the funds they need to get back to their nuclear weapons programs. But we haven't seen them conduct the same level of cyber sabotage like we did at Sony. So, it's interesting. Was that because we were so vocal about the potential for a response?
Thank you. So, perhaps a little ray of sunshine in there somewhere. We are going to try and squeeze in a last question here with Ruel. So Ruel, go right ahead. I think. Ruel, are you there? Oh, I'm sorry. Whoops. I messed up my own list. I beg your pardon. It's Ed Martins is coming next. And then if we possibly can, we'll squeeze in Ruel. Ed, Let's see if we can get your question in. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much for the talk today. My question is this: how many of these hackers out there, these bad actors, how many of them are governments, related to governments, and how many of them are just simply, criminals? I mean, the straight up the ransomwares. We're in it for the money. We don't care about the ideology. And how much crossover is there between them?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and it's sort of the question du jour because of ransomware. We do think that the groups launching these ransomware attacks the most high profile ransomware attacks are straight up cyber criminals. But with the caveat that the first thing their code does is look to see what your default language setting is. And if it's Russian, or if it's a language from sort of pre-Soviet days, they won't hack you. They'll move right along. Why? Because they operate in Russia with immunity, so long as they're not hacking inside the motherland, as I call it. So long as they avoid Russian targets or some of these states, or even Russian allies like Syria, then they're allowed to operate and do what they will. So, there's this question of, are they operating with, tacit encouragement from the Kremlin? Are they, helping achieve Russian national security objectives by showing the United States to be weak? Or, are they just operating this way because that's how they get immunity? But there's been a few cases where we've seen sort of a murkier relationship. So one is, and I'm going to blank, I think they're called, oh God, I forget. There's some Evil Corp. Okay, so there's this Russian cyber criminal group called Evil Corp, and they indicted one of its members recently, and in the indictments, they described him as a member of the FSB. And they didn't get as far as to say, some of Evil Corp's work is on behalf of the FSB. They just said, this guy also works for the FSB. We saw sort of a more detailed discussion of this relationship in the indictments of the guys who hacked Yahoo. So if you remember a couple years ago, 2015, 2014, Yahoo was hacked, I think, in its series of about 2 big cyber attacks, 2 major breaches. And when the indictments for those came out, they attributed the attack to, I think it was 4 guys. 2 of them were FSB agents, and then 2 of them were cyber criminals. And the way it worked was the cyber criminals were able to capture everyone's credentials, their Yahoo email address and their password, and sell that on the dark web for, however many millions of dollars. But when they found the personal Yahoo email address and password for someone who worked at the White House or the State Department, they passed that over to the FSB. So that's sort of how it works. You can profit so long as you're not targeting Russian systems. But if you find something that could be of value to the state, we expect you to pass that over. And Yahoo ended up being sort of the clearest demonstration of that. And then in other countries, it's similar but different. So in China, when I first started covering Chinese cyber espionage, most of the attacks were coming out of the PLA, the Chinese military, and they were often quite sloppy. But then once we started devoting more attention and headlines to Chinese cyber espionage, we actually saw a vast reorganization of China's cyber operations to the Ministry of State Security, sort of their NSA equivalent, because the Ministry of State Security was much more stealthy. And one of the things I learned in my book from some classified documents I read was that the way the Ministry of State Security does it is they outsource some of the most sensitive operations, hacks of American nuclear propulsion technology, that kind of thing, to private citizens who work at companies like Tencent during the day, but then get tapped on the shoulder for these sort of moonlighting operations at night. And we just saw that again with the Microsoft Exchange hack. What the indictment said was, these were individual contractors essentially who pulled off this operation for the state, but then, used some of that access that they'd gleaned for their own private ransomware cyber criminal activities. So, that's just how the world is moving. And unfortunately, we don't operate that way. And we have a severe cybersecurity labor shortage in the United States because most people who have these skills, these engineers, can go get these amazing salaries and job perks at Google, at Facebook, at Microsoft, at Palantir, at the defense contractors. And they'd much rather do that than go work inside government and have to deal with the red tape and the bureaucracy. And those that do work in government, you see these statistics for people who do these scholarships where they'll then go work for a government agency. They all want to go work on the exciting stuff, which is offense at NSA and Cyber Command. Very few want to go work in defense at some of the other government agencies or at the Department of Homeland Security, because it's just not as fun. It's just not as sexy or as mission oriented. And so we have a real problem filling those vacancies. And I don't know how we solve it, especially when we're up against adversaries that have the luxury of just telling someone that they're basically have forced conscription to go join a nation state operation.
So unfortunately, all we have time left to do is thank you very much, Nicole, for being with us tonight. And